So I've been reading a fair number of your comments as of late, and it seems that the general impression that people are getting of the FAA and governmental agencies in general when it comes to SpaceX and Starship is that the government is Elon's enemy, that the government is working as hard as it can to prevent Starship from becoming a reality and from taking to flight, and the continuous delays that we've received from the FAA seems to bolster this sort of theory. However, is this really the case? Is there any evidence that the FAA is completely opposed to this project or opposed to it to any degree? And also, is there any evidence to suggest that the current administration doesn't like it, or that SpaceX is incredibly frustrated, or has any public opinion on all of these FAA delays that we've been getting month after month? Well, actually, no. Elon has been saying very little about the matter, and the guy tends to be very outspoken when it comes to things that piss him off. And yet the only thing that he's really suggested is that once he gets approval, Starship should be ready in about a month. But what does this actually mean? Elon tends to be very cryptic in his meanings when he's talking about estimated time frames, and quite often he's not very accurate either. Even if the FAA were to give its approval today, would Starship really be ready to go to orbit in a month? In my opinion, no. And although I personally believe that this particular application is a little bit different simply because of the aggressive involvement of a variety of environmental organizations and the Environmental Protection Agency and others that are seeking to defend a very restricted area of protected wildlife that happens to exist in this region, one of my Patreon supporters who's retired from government acquisitions and had some first-hand dealing with these kinds of things has a different opinion, and I'd like to present that opinion in this video because I find it pretty compelling. He knows it's hard on all of us space geeks, himself included, and myself included, to not be getting a play-by-play of what's going, but the anger at the FAA over this particular application is misplaced. The FAA should be criticized for living in the prior paradigm of rocketry, having too much of the wrong kind of regulations on spaceflight, being too slow to advocate for change in their own institution, not showing some leadership where it's needed, and a lot of other misdeeds, but this application is not one of these problems. Contrary to popular belief, the FAA is not the enemy of Starship. The current administration is not the enemy of Starship, at least not yet, and I'm going to explain why in just a moment. In order to get a real idea of exactly what the FAA thinks about SpaceX's plans in Boca Chica, you only need to go to the FAA application itself, or the PEA as it is called, in order to see what they are recommending. That is to say, what they would prefer before they actually started this whole analysis. And it is very clear, quote, the FAA's proposed action, which is the preferred alternative, is to issue one or more experimental permits and or a vehicle operator license to SpaceX that would allow SpaceX to launch, which can include landing, Starship, and Super Heavy. SpaceX's goal is to use Starship/Super Heavy for low Earth orbit, sun synchronous orbit, geostationary transfer orbit, and interplanetary missions for cargo and humans. The environmental analysis in the PEA FAA focuses on the Boca Chica launch site, including potential additional development at the site. The FAA may conduct environmental reviews of additional proposed launch and re-entry sites if SpaceX further develops proposals. The FAA goes on to list a considerable number of different activities that SpaceX would be authorized to carry out at Boca Chica. And by the way, this is their proposed action. This is the thing that the FAA is recommending for the Boca Chica area. They're not saying that perhaps it could go this way, but this is another way it could go, and it's up to the FAA to determine which action we're going to take. This is their proposed action and what they recommended at the time that the application was submitted. And by the way, the application was submitted significantly after the new administration came into office. So unless the current administration does an about-face on the FAA's proposed action, something that really doesn't have a whole lot of precedent in American history, usually the administration doesn't take action against the FAA's recommendations unless something really extreme happens. This is the sort of thing that the FAA wants to happen, and it includes a lot. Test and launch operations, including Starship static fire engine tests, Super Heavy static fire engine tests, Starship suborbital launch, Super Heavy launch, Starship landing, Super Heavy landing. Also to test the structural capability of the launch vehicle stages, and nominal operation closures, about 500 hours worth of annual closure, which by the way, in my opinion, is not enough in order to deliver the sort of operational cadence that Starship is going to need to be effective, but let's move on. On top of that, anomaly response closures, so they're expecting starships to blow up, and they anticipate that this would require up to 300 hours of annual closure to be used at the discretion of Cameron County and other agencies. There's also related infrastructure construction, such as a redundant launch pad, a redundant landing pad, integration towers, tank structural test stands, desalination plant, support buildings and parking lots, power plant, trenching, payload processing facility, natural gas pretreatment system, liquefier, expanded solar farm, and State Highway 4 pull-offs. That is a lot of shit, and they are recommending that it all take place before the application is even subjected to a great deal of examination. That being the case, the FAA is obviously behind a lot of aggressive expansion of Starbase and SpaceX operations in the area, which is not surprising. The FAA is supposed to be behind the aggressive development of future aviation and spaceflight. How are you going to do that if you stand in the way of something like this? And in the proposed annual operations, Starship static fire engine tests are reserved 150 seconds worth of time, which is quite a lot given the fact that your average SpaceX static fire only lasts for 3 or 4 seconds at the most. And then you have Super Heavy static fire engine tests with 135 seconds per year reserved for that, 20 Starship suborbital launches per year during the program development phase, and 5 of these for the operational phase, 3 Super Heavy launches during the program development phase, increasing to 5 during the operational phase, and then finally Starship landing, having 23 during the program development phase and 10 during operational. Oh yeah, and also Super Heavy having 5 landings during operational phase. So that being the case, you're only looking at 5 stacked launches of Starship per year. Once again, not nearly enough to make Starship operational, at least if you're talking about orbital refilling. So Cape Canaveral and perhaps off-site launch facilities are going to be required in order to make all of this work. But still, these are the things that the FAA is recommending. The FAA goes on to describe Starship operations in extreme detail, everything that's required in order to allow Starship to take off, including including tank tests, static fires, and everything else that's going to require the closure area to be sealed off to the public. So all of these things are included in the proposal and once again being recommended by the FAA, including additional construction. Quote, SpaceX is proposing additional launch-related construction, including expanding the solar farm near the Launch and Landing Control Center, adding infrastructure and facilities at the VLA, parking lots, a liquid natural gas pretreatment system, a liquefier, a payload processing facility, and trenching and pull-offs along State Highway 4. At the VLA, SpaceX is proposing to construct a redundant launch pad and commodities, a redundant landing pad, 2 integration towers, tank structural test stands, a desalination plant, additional support buildings, and a power plant. That is a hell of a lot of detail, and all coming under the category of what the FAA is recommending. What happens if it's not approved? Well, there's the no action alternative. Quote, under the no action alternative, the FAA would not issue new experimental permits or licenses to SpaceX for any test or launch operations at the Boca Chica launch site. SpaceX could conduct missions of the Starship prototype launch vehicle as authorized by the current license. The license expires on May 27, 2022. This alternative provides the basis for comparing the environmental consequences of the proposed action. Period. Unquote. That's it. One paragraph that the FAA dedicates to what happens if they turn this whole thing down. They invested all of this time in describing an approval in extreme detail and also to make it very clear that this is what they were proposing and what they were recommending, and a very short 3-sentence paragraph as to what happens if it gets turned down. In my opinion, if the FAA was against this from the beginning, they wouldn't have bothered with all of this stuff. But unfortunately, it's not quite as simple as all that. As I previously reported, the Army Corps of Engineers has also got to give their go-ahead for additional construction on the site, and so far they haven't done that. There's actually no indications that SpaceX has resubmitted any sort of permit to the Army Corps of Engineers to get approval for all of these additional structures that are theoretically required in order to carry out stacked Starship launches. Now, they may have resubmitted this to the Army Corps of Engineers, and things may be moving forward, but at the moment we have no clear indication of this. That could be a complication that shuts SpaceX down regardless of whether the FAA gives its approval or not, but that's not the topic of this video. We're talking about the FAA. And even though it's easy to think that the FAA has just been sitting on their hands as far as this whole application is concerned, that actually is not the case. Linked in the description is a spreadsheet that the FAA has provided to the general public to demonstrate the progress that they've made thus far. And there's quite a few things as far as endangered species are concerned that has been completed. As a matter of fact, everything associated with this particular issue was completed as of April 22nd, 2022, less than 2 weeks ago. On top of that, there's a Section 106 review that's due to be completed on May 6th, 2022, 3 days from the time of this recording. And then finally, the environmental assessment. That is actually the only thing that remains with the project, and that is the thing that's scheduled to be wrapped up as of May 31st, 2022. Now, there's no guarantee that the environmental assessment is going to be approved at that time, or that the FAA is going to have sufficient time to work with other governmental agencies in order to get this approval. But I think it's important to note that if the FAA thought that endangered species were being put in jeopardy by this project, they would have shut it down already, because their entire analysis of this issue is now complete, and there would be no reason to continue with the environmental assessment if the Endangered Species Act was a problem. So this is a big hurdle that the FAA cleared on April 22nd, and a strong reason to believe that the FAA is ultimately going to approve this. Now that, once again, is not guaranteed, not at all. There are other governmental agencies involved with this, including the EPA, who may still shut this down. But one of my biggest concerns was the whole Endangered Species Act issue. The fact that Starship and its launch pad was in such close proximity to protected wildlife areas, and the fact that the FAA does not believe that endangered species are put in jeopardy by Starship, that is a big deal. And although I remain concerned that the Army Corps of Engineers may not give their approval for all of the additional structures and construction that needs to be done in order for SpaceX to carry out an orbital test, there's no real evidence to suggest that all of this is going to be necessary to carry out a very modest cadence of launches. In other words, 5 launches per year. You may be able to do that with a lot less construction. So even if the Army Corps of Engineers gets in the way on this issue, that may not be the end of operations in the Boca Chica area. It's also important to note that the local government in this area is very much behind what SpaceX is doing. They are bringing hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue to this region, a region that was not exactly flourishing from an economic standpoint before SpaceX arrived. Yes, there was a great deal of work going on in Port Isabel, and also a great deal of other types of construction and manufacturing, including ULA, by the way. They've had a facility in this area for a very long period of time, but SpaceX has brought a lot more money to a region that could really use it. So this is an important consideration as well. And another thing that we really need to keep in mind, something that we should do our best to avoid, is to get into the mindset of thinking insert political party that you hate here is against Elon, hates Elon, and is going to stand in the way of everything that he does. There is no evidence to support this yet. There could be in the future, but not at this time. And it's important to remember that it was Obama who created the Commercial Crew Project in the first place. It was NASA under the Obama administration that approved Crew Dragon as one of the 2 alternatives to get the human race back into orbit, at least from American soil. And of course, it was the Trump administration who spearheaded the whole Artemis project. So both sides of the political spectrum have been supporting private space flight in a big way for many years, in spite of strong opposition from people on both sides of the political spectrum as well. Both Democrats and Republicans, and sadly Neil Armstrong and Gene Cernan, were vehemently opposed to the privatization of spaceflight and everything that SpaceX was doing. If you watched a recent documentary on this issue, it was something that brought Elon Musk to tears during an interview when he was confronted with this particular fact, that people that he regarded as heroes were so fundamentally opposed to what he was doing. And remember, it was the Obama administration who approved it in the first place, and it was the Trump administration that kept the whole thing going. This is a truly bilateral issue. Both Democrats and Republicans support the expansion of spaceflight into the solar system. Yes, there are many politicians on both sides who oppose it for their own particular selfish reasons, in my opinion, but overall, given the behavior of the past 2 administrations, and indeed the third one, which by the way is being led by a guy who worked for Obama as vice president, I think that there's very little evidence to indicate that any political party as a whole is opposed to what SpaceX is doing. If the current administration was against Starship and wanted to stop it, the FAA would have done it already. I don't think that's what's happening right now, and that is something that once again was supported by my team member who was part of government contracts in the first place. Quote, "What's going on with Boca looks like the normal process, frustrating and Byzantine as it is, but the FAA has already recommended approving the permit in the draft. Keep in mind that new spaceports don't happen often enough for either SpaceX or the FAA or anyone else to make them routine," unquote. And yeah, I think that's a pretty good summary of everything that's happening at the moment. However, this could all change. As I've mentioned in previous videos, Elon's whole escapade with Twitter and his willingness to unblock lots of individuals who are saying some very controversial things that the current administration may not be happy about, that could make Elon a political enemy of the current president. Who knows? It could happen. It's something that I continue to think is a mistake on Elon's part and something that could lead to further problems and further obstruction from the government. I don't think it's happening yet, but it's something that could very well happen. And once again, I continue to think that this was something that Elon may have done to make himself an even more relevant person in today's society, but may put his ambitions of getting us to Mars in a bit of jeopardy. So that's just my opinion as far as that's concerned, and I also feel that Starship will not fly this year probably as a result of all of the new developments and changes that have happened to the design, most significant of which is Raptor 2. If you think I am wrong about this, subscribe to the channel and become a part of the 100K challenge, because if you're right and Starship flies before Vulcan makes it to the moon, I will be tattooing SpaceX fanboy on my butt. And if you'd like to support future journeys to Boca Chica or to Cape Canaveral to watch these very important moments in private space flight and public space flight for that matter happen in the near future, well, by all means, check in the description. There are many ways to support this channel. So until the FAA finally gets their job done, and then we can put SpaceX to the test and really find out what's going on with Starship and just how quickly this monumental moment in the future of human spaceflight is going to finally take place, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.